Welcome to this explainer. So picture this. You've got a supremely confident Europe, a continent just sitting right at the absolute pinnacle of global influence, wealth, and culture. But then, almost entirely by its own doing, it stumbles into a mechanized slaughter that literally reshaped the entire globe. How does that even happen? How did the modern world actually emerge from the fire and mud of the trenches? Well, today we're going to explore the crazy story of how empires fell, borders were totally erased, and the 20th century as we know it was truly born. Right on the eve of the conflict, British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey uttered these incredibly haunting words. He said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." It's a quote that just perfectly captures the tragic irony of the era. They called it the Belle Epoque, the beautiful era. Think grand operas, bustling cafes, incredible technological marvels. But this glittering facade, it was about to be abruptly extinguished, foreshadowing a darkness and a global conflagration that literally no one was truly prepared for. To wrap our heads around this, we're going to structure this explainer into 5 distinct stages: the powder keg, the spark and the fall, the furnace of total war, turning tides and collapse, and finally, a shattered new world. Let's get right into it. Part 1. The powder keg, Europe before the storm. Okay, so leading up to the war, Europe had essentially divided itself into 2 massively armed camps. On one side, you've got the Triple Entente. That's France, Britain, and Russia. They were brought together primarily by a mutual fear, really a deep suspicion of Germany's rapid rise and its aggressive naval expansion. And on the other side, the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Italy, who were terrified of being encircled by those rivals. Now, what's really crucial here is that these blocs created a catastrophic structure of mutual obligation. It was a giant tripwire. Because of these incredibly rigid alliances, any tiny regional crisis could easily act as a trap, dragging absolutely everyone into a massive war. Add to that mix some aggressive imperial rivalries and incredibly volatile nationalism, and the tension was just off the charts. This all culminated in what's known as the infamous blank check. In 1914, Germany pledged unconditional support to Austria-Hungary. They were basically telling them, hey, do whatever you feel is necessary and we've got your back, even if it means going to war with Russia. It was a move rooted in massive overconfidence and just a terrible strategic misjudgment. This fatal diplomatic assurance was the ultimate primer. The continent was now totally rigged for disaster. Part 2. The spark and the fall. The descent into war. When things finally kicked off, the July crisis moved incredibly fast. On June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated. And the tragic irony of how this happened is just staggering. After an earlier bombing attempt completely failed, the Archduke's driver literally just made a wrong turn. As he stopped to back up, he happened to park right in front of a delicatessen where Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old nationalist assassin, had just stepped out. I mean, what are the odds? Princip fired 2 shots, and the dominoes immediately began to fall. Exactly 1 month later, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Russia mobilized to defend Serbia, Germany declared war on Russia and France, and by August 4th, Britain entered the war. In a matter of weeks, a localized regional dispute turned into a global nightmare, all because leaders completely blew past every single possible diplomatic off-ramp. Militarily speaking, Germany was terrified of a 2-front war against France and Russia. So their big solution was the Schlieffen Plan. This was a super rigid military doctrine that relied entirely on lightning speed. Here was the idea. Step 1, sweep massively through neutral Belgium. Step 2, pivot down into northern France. Step 3, envelop Paris from the west and defeat France in just 6 weeks. And finally, step 4, quickly pack the troops onto trains and shift east to face the much slower mobilizing Russian army. The problem? It relied on some truly fatal assumptions, like Belgium not fighting back, Britain not intervening, and timetables holding perfectly. And, well, spoiler alert, absolutely none of that happened. Because all those assumptions completely failed, the myth of a swift, mobile war just died on the vine. Everyone actually thought they'd be home by Christmas. They marched off to war with these optimistic cavalry charges and brightly colored uniforms. But by November 1914, those illusions had totally evaporated. Trench lines literally zigzagged all the way from the Swiss border up to the North Sea. This mobile conflict had frozen into a static, muddy, terrifying nightmare of attrition. The dream of a quick victory was officially dead. Part 3. The Furnace of Total War, Mechanized Slaughter. At this point, the war evolved into something humanity had never seen before, driven by a terrifying new 20th century arsenal. We are talking about quick-firing artillery that literally churned the Earth into these barren lunar landscapes, endless miles of barbed wire, machine guns that could just mow down entire battalions in minutes, and of course, the horrific introduction of poison gas, like chlorine and mustard gas. Add to that primitive tanks, aircraft dropping bombs, and U-boats prowling the seas. The battlefield basically became a literal laboratory of death. Military technology had evolved to this weird point where defense overwhelmingly beat offense, which made any forward advancement nearly impossible without taking massive, massive casualties. Which brings us to the sheer, unimaginable scale of the fighting. A perfect example is the Battle of Verdun in 1916. They shall not pass. That became the rallying cry for the whole French nation. But Verdun wasn't a battle of maneuver at all. It was explicitly designed by the German High Command to be a meat grinder. Their stated goal was literally to bleed France white by forcing them into this endless battle of attrition. For 10 brutal months, these armies fought over tiny patches of completely destroyed Earth, resulting in nearly 700,000 casualties. And shortly after that, the British launched the Somme offensive, which resulted in over 1 million casualties. These weren't just battles anymore. They were massive industrial furnaces consuming human lives. But, it's absolutely vital that we contrast those massive macro-level statistics with a micro-level human tragedy. Listen to what one British soldier remarked. "We live like rats in the mud, we sleep standing up, we eat with our hands, and we die without warning." It just completely humanizes the unimaginable conditions they were in. Soldiers were trapped in freezing, waterlogged trenches, constantly dealing with lice, rots, disease, and the endless, nerve-shattering terror of random artillery fire. And remember, this was a total war. It was a conflict that consumed entire societies. The line between the home front and the actual battlefield completely blurred away. The massive industrial might of entire nations was 100% redirected to the front lines. Governments seized control of factories, implemented strict rationing, and pumped out mass propaganda. Millions of women entered munitions factories, taking on incredibly dangerous work just to keep the armies supplied. Plus, this expanded way beyond Europe, pulling in massive numbers of colonial troops from places like India to Senegal. It was a truly global struggle in every sense of the word. Part 4. Turning Tides and Collapse, 1918. By 1918, some dramatic shifts were completely altering the trajectory of the war. First up, a massive geopolitical earthquake. The Bolshevik Revolution pulls an absolutely exhausted Russia out of the conflict by March. Now, this is a big deal because it allows Germany to shift all of its eastern forces to the west for one final desperate gamble, the spring offensive. But the gamble fails. They advance, sure, but they completely overstretch their supply lines. And then comes the true turning of the tide, the arrival of American forces. By mid-1918, fresh U.S. troops are arriving by the tens of thousands every single day, backed up by immense American industrial might. This all culminates in the Allied 100 Days Offensive in August. By utilizing brand new combined arms tactics, mixing tanks and aircraft, they finally shatter the German lines, pushing the Central Powers into total collapse. Part 5. A Shattered New World. The Ashes. 20 million. I just want to let that staggering number sink in for a second. Over 20 million soldiers and civilians died in this mechanized slaughter, and on top of that, another 21 million were physically or psychologically wounded. It was a level of devastation that quite literally hollowed out entire generations and completely broke the psyche of the modern world. In the aftermath, the map of the world was entirely erased and redrawn. 4 massive, centuries-old empires vanished practically overnight. The German Kaiser abdicated, leaving behind a fragile, highly unstable republic. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was totally dissolved into smaller, often warring states. The Russian Empire was overthrown by the Bolsheviks and plunged straight into a brutal civil war. And the Ottoman Empire, it was partitioned up by the victors into mandates, drastically reshaping the Middle East in ways we are very much still feeling today. Then, there was the sheer financial cost imposed on the losers. 132 billion gold marks. That was the devastating reparations bill handed to Germany by the victorious Allies. This staggering financial burden was meant to punish Germany and pay for the rebuilding of France and Belgium. But instead, it completely crippled the German economy. It set the direct stage for the catastrophic hyperinflation of the 1920s, a time when literal wheelbarrows full of cash couldn't even buy you a loaf of bread. And it bred a deep, extremely dangerous sense of national resentment. All of this was codified in the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. It included Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the entire war. It enacted harsh territorial losses and stripped the German military down to a bare-bones skeleton force. Now, it did create the League of Nations to theoretically prevent future wars, but it was incredibly weak from the start, especially since the US Senate completely refused to join it. Furthermore, the treaty totally ignored the pleas for self-determination from colonized peoples around the globe. In Germany, this was widely seen as a dictated peace, a diktat, that entirely failed to heal the world. Instead, it left deep psychological scars and created a stab-in-the-back myth that extremist groups, including the rising Nazi Party, would very eagerly exploit. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought to consider. If a war that was famously meant to end all wars ultimately only planted the toxic seeds for an even greater, more horrific catastrophe just 2 decades later, what lessons about the delicate balance between vengeance and justice have we truly learned? The Great War birthed the modern world, yes, for sure, but it built it on a foundation of unresolved trauma and fractured borders. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the history around you, and I'll see you next time.